Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll start my kind of quick chat today with a little bit of an introduction about myself. And what I wanted to talk about was really the AI and digital transformation in a post-pandemic world. Obviously, it's been a difficult situation for a lot of people, a lot of companies, and a lot of countries. And hopefully, with the vaccines that are coming out and what we're seeing, this should results in a different world, I think, going forward. And I think AI and digital transformation has a big place within that sort of effort. So in terms of myself, super quick, born and raised in Hong Kong, did all my high school education here, went to the US for my undergrad, and I started my career as a private banker. So over in New York at Citi, worked on both the investment and the relationship management sides. After that, I went to business school, and post business school, I went to work at an internet infrastructure startup in Myanmar. So we were building the fiber optic in the ground, the cell phone towers, the data centers, that type of stuff. So if anyone has any questions on kind of these AI and digital transformation efforts in frontier markets, I'm more than happy to take those as well. Currently, I'm working at a company called Blue Artificial Intelligence, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But when we started the company here at Blue, we noticed that a lot of people, when they were faced with AI, they felt either fear or confusion. And I think the fear comes from, or I should say, let me start with the confusion. I think the confusion comes from the fact that there's a lot of math and algorithms and very advanced stuff in the background with AI. And I think that leads often to a lot of confusion, as does a lot of the terminology, right? You talk about things like neural networks, a lot of these kind of technologies that are used with AI tend to be seen in a very sort of hard to understand light, right? So I think on one side, you've got the confusion. And then on the other side, I think you've also got the fear with AI, right? And I think the fear probably comes from two main areas, I would say. Number one, I think when you have Hollywood and movies with AI, never ends well for the human beings, right? You always tend to see the AI like do something bad, kill some humans. And I think when you've got that much of a reinforcing message from the media, I think people's sort of starting assumptions about AI tend to be negative. Then I think the second part of that is, a lot of people are afraid of AI because it's going to come and take away their jobs. And so because of that, we realized that a lot of the effort within the AI space needs to be made on education. And that's why I teach at a bunch of universities, including AIT, some in Hong Kong, some, obviously AIT in Thailand, and a few others around the world as well. And I think it's very important that we think about education to specifically address the fear and confusion part that's often associated with AI and the resulting digital transformation that comes about because of it. Now, in terms of Blue, I think we do a lot of stuff on the consulting side with regards to AI. But again, as I mentioned before, a larger and larger piece of what we do concentrates on that AI education space, because I do think we really need to address that sort of fear and confusion. And I think part of that is also awareness, right? Making people more aware of what AI is and more aware of what it can do. And that's why I really enjoy doing these types of talks, because I think it starts to help the awareness. And I think that's the first step in what's tends to be a longer process with digital transformation and AI. So if we consider what's happened and how has this affected business models, it's important to look at what have the effects of the pandemic been on businesses. And I think one of the best ways to do this is literally to ask the people who are at these firms. So recently, PwC, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the firm, did this specifically. So they went to a bunch of CFOs and they asked them, what are the issues that are coming up with specifically the pandemic? And so I think the interesting thing, and this shouldn't really surprise anybody, is that most CFOs expected, their bottom lines to be hit, right? And I think the interesting part, though, is the second sentence here, which reads, to rebuild revenue streams, 63% are planning changes to their product or service offerings. And I think this is when that idea of digital transformation and using AI starts to become even more interesting, right? Because, okay, something bad happened, what do we do about it? and if that what do we do about it part is going to result in a lot of AI and digital transformation, that means there's a lot of motivation from organizations to actually start doing stuff. And I think that's when, potentially things get really interesting on the digital transformation side, because you can do all the analysis, you can, look at all the Excel sheets that tell you how much money you're going to save. But if you don't have motivation from the top, of companies and the top of institutions, it's hard to actually push things through. So I think the interesting part for me here is that it seems like the motivation piece is definitely there as well. Now, to complete the picture in terms of, how many CFOs potentially are thinking about this, I thought this chart was really interesting because it only showed that 7% of them think that revenues and profits are going to increase, and the remaining 93% are not. Okay, so that again in itself kind of shows you that everyone's thinking that that revenue piece is going to go down. Again, not surprising, but I think it's important to look at the extent of that. Right, 93 versus 7, huge majority view that things are going to be rough for 2020. And so now as we go to 2021. The big question is, what are they going to do? And if we look at where they're going to implement changes, I think the biggest kind of areas were within the products and services and within pricing strategies. And I know pricing strategies sounds like a little bit of an interesting one there, but I want to show later on how AI and some of the digital transformation will actually give us some of the data to inform some of these pricing strategies. Now, just to finish the CFO part, because I think it's useful again, right? Is to think about if they're going to potentially cut CapEx and they're going to have some cost savings, like where are they actually going to do that? And you'll notice that it's not really the digital transformation parts, according to them. They're thinking much more general CapEx, operations, workforce, IT, but there's quite a few of them that are on before digital transformation. Now, again, I think this is highly dependent on the population you survey, but generally I think you tend to see that, right? You're not going to so much cut from what you don't have yet, you're going to cut from what you currently have. So I think that's a pretty popular view as to how people are thinking, budgets are going to be affected going forward as well. Because again, it's important to have motivation, but you've also got to have the means to do it. And so I think those two things typically have to combine for this type of stuff as well. So if we have that sort of idea in mind, right, and we're thinking about, where are these efforts going to be made, I think it's also important to look at, from a business perspective, which sectors are most affected by the pandemic. So I thought this was also an interesting chart because what it did is it showed all the different industries that are out there, or I should say not all, but some of the main ones. And it showed what are the projected negative effects, right? So if you consider the chart, what's actually happening is, if you have more white in the pie chart, it's expected to have a more minor impact. And the more kind of, the proportion that's marked in black, those are ones where you're expected to have severe issues, right? So we kind of consider all of these and you look at the ones where you have the most black, we tend to see that retail potentially is the ones that's most affected. You've also got manufacturing and then probably not surprising, travel and transportation as well. So I think the interesting part about this chart is that it shows that not every industry is going to be affected equally, which therefore means that some industries will obviously want to do more digital transformation in AI, and some might want to do a little bit less, right? So if we kind of then consider, okay, you've got all these industries, right? And they've obviously got motivations, right? They've got certain things that they want to do that potentially AI is helpful. And through the most of our consulting work and sort of the last, I'd say 6 months to a year, I would say that the buckets of what companies want to do probably sit in these 3 categories. Okay, so one is customer insights, which is where you use data and AI to better understand and predict, what's going to happen in the future with customers. Okay, the idea, or I should say the motivation there, is ultimately to gain customers and increase your market share with that. And again, data is very, very useful to gain these types of customer insights. And then some of the next few slides, I'll show you a couple of examples of this where companies have actually gone out and used AI and digital transformation to address customer insights specifically. Number 2, risk reduction. So a lot of the fraud and a lot of, risk issues that we tend to see, are ones that AI often can easily catch. And for those of you not familiar with kind of the technologies of AI, one of the main branches of AI is something called machine learning. You might have heard the term. On a very simplified level, machine learning is about identifying patterns and then predicting outcomes. Okay. So often when you've got fraud, for example, fraud and the way it works or the way it happens, is often something that you can look at on a rules-based level, right? So the idea is, let's say Kevin has a credit card. Kevin normally spends, or average price of his kind of swipe is, 50 US dollars, let's say, and he only uses it in Hong Kong. And if that's the pattern that you know about Kevin, as soon as he's spending 20,000 US dollars in Paris, France, you know that there could be a problem. And so often that idea when we use machine learning to look at patterns and then predict outcomes based off of that is a big area of fraud and risk reduction, right? Because a lot of this stuff is very rules based. Anything falls outside the pattern, go and look at it. And it's often for AI, it's much easier to do that as well. So I think risk reduction is another big area that we tend to see. And I think another key point about the environment in the pandemic that makes risk reduction more interesting is that during times of fraud and economic recession, during times of kind of economic difficulty and recession, you tend to see fraud go up, right? It's been looked at in a lot of studies, and their general concept is fraud levels skyrocket during times of economic distress in countries. And so I think that's another reason why risk reduction has been one of the key priorities for a lot of companies that we've talked to. And then I think lastly is cost efficiency as well. I think cost efficiency has always historically been a good motivation for using AI and digital transformation. But I think the key difference now is that a lot of companies are finding their business models are fundamentally changing, right? Revenues were at 100, now they're at 10 because of what's happened with the pandemic, and they really, really need to change. So, the concept of food delivery versus having, physical restaurant locations, right? That's a fundamental business model change. And I think before your cost efficiency benefit was maybe a little bit smaller, but now because your business model is changing so drastically, using AI and digital transformation to streamline and automate is something else that a lot of companies have come to us and have started talking about as well. So I think potentially, these three buckets, I think is where we're seeing most of the interest from an overall AI perspective. Now, I wanted, rather than talk about individual examples, which I will do in a second, I wanted to leave the audience also with a little bit of a framework, because I think, throughout the next kind of day or so with the AIT event here, I think you'll see a lot of examples of AI being used. And I think all of those are good to know. I think they're great for inspiration. But I think from a business perspective, sometimes it's also important to think about what are the right frameworks we should use? Like, what's the way to think about some of this stuff in a sort of business-minded way, okay? And so I think along those lines, the way I would start to think about it is consider for a business, what can we not afford, right? Like, there's a lot of nice things that we can have, but what are the things that we really, really cannot afford to happen? And I think once we figure those out, the next question is, can we apply AI to it? And I think it's important for a lot of people to realize that AI is not always the solution, right? Sometimes it might be more cost efficient to hire people, and we can certainly have the discussion on when that's the case and when that's not the case. But you've got to figure out how you address the piece on what can we not afford. Now, often, the idea is AI, right? So I'm not going to say it's always AI, but sometimes it is. And if that's the case, then if we use that specific AI, what is the win that we're going to have? And I like that as a framework because it often will help companies, C-suite folks that we talk to, prioritize what they should do. And I think that's really, really important. So if we take the example of a bank here, right? I think it's important to think about, your specific industry and what can we not afford. My background, pre-AI was in financial services. So this tends to be a slightly easier example for me to articulate. I was working in private banking, we've seen this type of stuff happen at banks in general. And I think often when we kind of consider that risk management bucket, right? I think the way to think about it is really to do that deep dive within your company or your industry Or if you're consulting or providing advice to someone, think of it that way as well, right? What's the industry that you have? What can you not afford? How can you use it? And then therefore, what will it ensure? Okay, so basically this kind of bottom row of a row of boxes here. So if we think about the very kind of simple example when it comes to financial services, and we talk about money laundering, one of the ways you can think about doing that is we say, okay, look, money laundering is the issue that we have, whether that's cyber attacks, fraud, again, can happen in many ways. But one of the ways you address that is through something called deep learning, right? And again, if people have questions on that, we can certainly take that in the time that we have. But let's for now say that that's just the AI kind of tool we use to assure that we don't actually get the fraud. And if we can do that subsequently, the really big win for us is that we end up maintaining customer trust and also avoiding massive fines, right? And I'll talk to you guys in a little bit of a second about some of the examples, where we see these issues of massive fines. So with that framework in mind, then, I wanted to then show you a few examples from finance where we do see some of this AI and digital transformation. Okay, so Jpmorgan Chase, a really interesting document analysis tool, right, called Contract Intelligence. Again, we can go through the ins and outs of the product itself, but I think the important part is to look at, what actually happens here, right? What's the kind of the key takeaway? And the key takeaway is that they were able in these documents, when you did the analysis, to take out 150 the kind of data points from 12,000 documents in seconds. Okay, and so again, that's along the lines of the efficiency argument that we had talked about before. And if you try to quantify that efficiency, it basically ended up saving 15,000 man days, right? Or I should say like manual work days of people in the year. So in this kind of post-pandemic world, when we're thinking it's hard even to get people into an office, right? For a lot of the companies out there that are thinking, hey, what's the business use case for this type of stuff? In a post-pandemic world, when it might be difficult to have people come to the office, talk about stuff, perhaps a tool like this starts to become more interesting. And if we can use that in that area, you can also see potential examples in marketing, in investments, in due diligence, right? So this idea of efficiency, streamlining, doing stuff in a smarter way, definitely going to be useful, A, before the pandemic, but potentially B, after the pandemic as well. Now, I think deep learning is also interesting, right, on the fraud side. And I bring up fraud because in kind of your pandemic world, we probably expect more fraud given the recession, given the difficulties that a lot of companies will be going through. So Danske Bank, interesting kind of case here where they partnered up with Teradata. And effectively what they were looking at is trying to figure out how do we pick out fraud, right? And so one of the ways you do that is you have people sitting there. One of the simple automation ways you do that is by having a rules-based engine. So just saying, like our example before, Kevin's credit card is used outside, place like Hong Kong, immediately flag it, right? And when you do that, you can actually start to see what are the impacts in terms of the results, right? So here we've got a false positive rate, which basically means that you flag fraud when it's not actually fraud, right? So that's a false positive. And what they then did is they looked at a bunch of different AI methodologies and they tried to see, where were they getting results? And so the rules-based engine, as you can tell, compared to your final tool of deep learning, a lot fewer false positives and a lot more true positives. And so with that, what ended up happening is, they were starting to then to see that they could avoid this sort of false positive amount. Because the problem with a false positive is that you then need human beings to be there, and the human beings then need to check what's going on. And if it's a false positive, then that means that you've wasted some of those resources, which you could have placed in other places as well, right? Now, why overall, therefore, you should be thinking, is this important to the bank itself? And so let's come back to that initial question that we had, which was, what can we not afford to get wrong? And the challenge when it comes to banks specifically is that there's often massive fines if you get this anti-money laundering or if you get this sort of compliance piece not working in your bank, right? And these numbers are huge, right? $2 billion is real money. And we're seeing a lot of other banks also have some potential fines and some issues, when this piece of their business is not going well. So in a post-pandemic world, when you see a lot of potential fraud that's happening, for banks, that's a huge motivation, right? To sort of, get off their behind and actually start using some of this AI and digital transformation. Whereas before, in the pre-pandemic case, that might not actually have been as true for many of them. Now, I think the other piece is also to think about how is the sort of AI and digital transformation kind of ecosystem looking like? And it's hard to make massive generalizations, but if you look at banks and some of the other kind of pharma companies or many folks in different industries, you see a lot of large companies getting together with smaller AI providers, right? Small like technology vendors. I wouldn't say smaller. Some of them are like the big Microsofts and Googles of the world. So we're seeing a few of those. In other cases, in more specialized industries, you are seeing them partner with smaller tech companies and tech vendors as well. So I think from the perspective of doing digital transformation, it is often hard for companies to hire these specific folks because they're very expensive. Like just from a supply demand perspective, AI talent's actually quite hard to find. I'm pretty sure that as we do more courses and train people at the university level, I think that supply constraint becomes a little bit better. But at least for now, I think there's definitely a lack of talent in sort of the AI and digital transformation space. So I think many companies, what they're doing, the sort of less risky way of approaching a lot of these digital transformation initiatives is to go out and partner with specific AI vendors to address your what can we not afford use cases. So in this case, I've just highlighted two, AlphaSense and Aporia. I think they tend to look at more intelligent document search, looking at earnings call analysis, for example. So you basically, get the CFO's call that they have every quarter, have the AI kind of analyze it, and then come to some sort of insights based off of that, right? Again, I think a lot of this is in that automation kind of efficiency bucket. But again, what I wanted to show here is not so much the use case itself, but I wanted to show you more about the typical structure in the ecosystem that we tend to see. Now, for a lot of the larger banks, for a lot of the larger companies, they are trying to hire their own data science and artificial intelligence teams. I think it makes sense when you think about the type of scale that they're using. But for those companies that are looking to dip their toe in this area, rather than go out and hire a bunch of people, it might be more interesting to go and talk to some of the vendors and figure out, is there somebody that you can potentially partner with? Now, within the sort of vendor selection, right? And again, we do the consulting for this for many of our clients, so it's a large, in-depth process. But on a very high level, when you think about different technology vendors, especially with AI, you want to make sure that a lot of these folks have specialties in your industry vertical, because it is very hard to train an AI to do everything, right? Like even if we're doing document analysis, and in this case, these guys are very good at document analysis within the finance area. But if you give them document analysis in, let's say, the healthcare space, so we've got a couple of projects where we would be looking at, one of the documents is prescriptions that doctors write. So an 80-year-old, when they write a prescription, some of their handwriting isn't really that good. And so either it's the handwriting quality of the doctor or even the complicated chemical names. So if your AI system has never seen that in terms of the training data and in terms of what it's done before, it's very hard for that to be a good tool for a healthcare provider. So I think the thing to think about, if you're in charge of digital transformation or you're doing that for your company or industry, try to find a vendor that has experience within that industry vertical. Because if they do, then their AI or their data models will probably be more inclined towards what you want to do rather than having to train something from scratch. Okay, so that would be my very kind of high level comment in terms of searching for a technology vendor to help with your AI and digital transformation efforts going forward. So I know I'm almost out of time. So just to overall summarize, I think, one of the big kind of priorities, or I should say set of priorities in a post-pandemic world for me falls into these three buckets: consumer insights, cost efficiency, and risk reduction. And ultimately, if you're going to approach this specific effort, right, you probably want to think about what is that relationship between the amount that I want to invest and how much ROI am I going to get. Now, ROI, return on investment, is not always just about money, right? It could be about social good. It could be about, your impact on your employees. There's many ways to judge return, and that's actually another interesting area that we're seeing with a lot of companies that we talk to. Is in this kind of post-pandemic world, many companies are thinking more about social good, more about what can they do with this technology to impact society in a positive way. And if there's been, a silver lining or two with COVID and the pandemic, it's that at least people and companies are thinking about this stuff. And that for me is a very kind of heartwarming takeaway, because it does seem like, this has changed values and mentalities for certain companies and people. And I think that's, that can only be positive going forward. So the question for us kind of going forward is, how can we help corporate clients do this faster, better, and cheaper? And I think for all of you, those are the right types of questions to ask as well. Can AI and digital transformation ultimately result in these types of initiatives going forward? So with that, I have a couple of minutes. So I'm more than happy to take questions from you guys. In the meanwhile, I'm always happy to continue this discussion as well. So feel free to connect with me over LinkedIn. Always happy to have the chat about AI, talk about this type of stuff in more detail. And it's kind of what we do. So we really enjoy that going forward. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.